Welcome to Music from Home, a series of videos by Yakima Symphony Orchestra musicians. My name is David McLemore. I am the principal tubist of the Yakima Symphony Orchestra, as well as the professor of tuba and euphonium at Central Washington University. In most genres of music, whether you're thinking of orchestral music, popular music, jazz music, different instruments or voices are going to perform different lines. And these lines are going to have different kinds of functions. There are melodic lines, there's bass lines, there is rhythmic and harmonic support, there are counter melodies. You can think of these different lines with their differing functions like layers of a cake or ingredients in a recipe. All of them contribute to the overall soundscape that a composer or an arranger is trying to create. But just like in certain recipes, you're going to have particular flavors which kind of come to the forefront of your awareness. There are going to be certain lines, certain sounds that stick out to you as the listener. For example, the melody should, by definition, always be front and center in terms of your awareness as the listener. The melody, the melodic line should always sound louder within the ensemble, sounding on top or above the other lines, counter melodies, bass lines, rhythmic and harmonic support. Now, I would understand if you assumed the tuba being the lowest bass voice in the brass family. I could understand the assumption that all the tuba plays is bass lines. I certainly do play bass lines a fair amount of the time, but you'd be surprised. The tuba is, in orchestral music, called to wear a fair number of hats, even within the context of playing bass lines. There are a range of different orchestrations of combinations of instruments that composers use the tuba with. But also, in terms of just strictly looking at the tuba parts themselves, there is a range of motivic function present. Yes, I play the bass line a fair amount, but also rhythmic and harmonic accompaniment material, and also sometimes counter melodies, and even some melodic moments. So to begin, I need to present a caveat. As I talked about in one of my previous Music from Home videos, the tuba is a relatively young brass instrument. So when I talk about the role of the tuba in the orchestra, I'm talking about a romantic / 20th, 21st century orchestra. We're talking about an orchestra from approximately 1850 onward. So the first and most obvious use of the tuba is in 2D passages where you have the entire orchestra or the entire brass section. Composers and arrangers will often include the tuba in that complement. And the reason is very simple. The tuba, being, again, the bass voice of the brass section, it kind of helps to broaden out the sound and adds more depth and resonance and power to it. So essentially, we're talking about harmonically supporting, in the case of with the full 2D orchestra, harmonically supporting the entire ensemble. Or if it's just the brass section, kind of providing that harmonic underpinning, that cushion for the rest of the brass instruments, the trombones, the horns, and the trumpets to sit on top of. It is worth mentioning that when the tuba is used with the 2D orchestra, the tuba isn't the only foundational bass voice. The tuba is essentially working in conjunction or in cooperation with the other bass voices in the other families. So I'm often playing the same notes, either at pitch or octave displaced, as the string basses, or the bassoons, the contrabassoons, or the timpani. Essentially, the tuba is part of the bass team, if you will. Composers and arrangers will often use the tuba as an extension of the trombone section, but also as part of a duet pair with the bass trombone. The tuba is very effective when you put it at the bottom of a trombone section. You know, if it's a trombone trio, if there are 3 trombones, you make it a quartet. If it's one of these more expansive orchestral works with 4 trombone parts, then it becomes a quintet. The tuba adds power and harmonic support to the section. Now, when composers and arrangers write for this quartet, sometimes quintet, you'll find that this complement of instruments is equally suitable for playing broad, sustained music, think like chorales, but also short, biting music, punctuated material, in other words. It is worth mentioning there are exceptions, however. There are composers who have treated the tuba and trombone section far more contrapuntally. Think about the jazz section from Hindemith's Symphonic Metamorphosis, the second movement. So you're going to want to listen for this texture in the music of Mahler, Wagner, Bruckner, Tchaikovsky, Brahms, Berlioz, Verdi. In fact, one of my favorite chorales with the trombone section occurs at the very beginning, the overture to Verdi's opera Nabucco. The tuba and the bass trombone make a very interesting pairing, and a very effective one for composers and arrangers, particularly when they're looking to have very loud, powerful music with a pronounced sense of weight. The bass trombone is, of course, a cylindrical instrument, whereas the tuba is a conical instrument. Now, what this means is the tuba has a rounder, more buoyant sound, whereas the bass trombone has a lot more focus to it. So it's a really interesting combination. A lot of times you'll see tuba and bass trombone playing either in unison or at the octave. Typically homophonic, we're typically playing in the same, identical or very similar rhythm. And again, in octaves or unison, so we're reinforcing each other in terms of the pitch. For good examples of tuba paired with bass trombone, listen to the music of Shostakovich, Prokofiev, Copland, Mussorgsky, Stravinsky, Respighi. We recently performed Fountains of Rome, and that has a particularly difficult and challenging bass line that's also kind of a counter melody that the tuba and the bass trombone play. Moving away from the trombone section, there are other instrument groups that the tuba will sometimes be paired with. The first of which is the horns, the horn section, which makes sense when you think about it. The horns are the other conical brass instruments on the stage. You know, the trumpets and trombones are cylindrical brass. Tuba and the horn were the conical brass family. So it makes sense that composers would exploit that and write tuba essentially as a fifth horn part in certain passages. Now, a particular manifestation of this pairing actually occurs, it's very specific to the music of Richard Wagner and Anton Bruckner, and that has to do with their use of Wagner tuba. Now, as I discussed in my last Music from Home video, Wagner tubas are not, strictly speaking, a tuba that a tuba player would play. A horn player plays a Wagner tuba. For example, Bruckner's Symphony No. 7. There is, in addition to the actual horn section, there is separate from the horn section a quartet of Wagner tuba. And so there are musical passages where, just as composers like Mahler might pair the tuba as the bottom of at the bottom of a trombone quartet, making a quintet, you essentially have the tuba at the bottom of this quartet of Wagner tuba, making this tuba quintet, if you will. Another common use of the tuba is in conjunction with the double bass section. Now, I mentioned earlier that when you have full orchestral tutti, the tuba is essentially sharing bass function with the double basses, with the bassoons and contrabassoons, with the timpani. But there are some composers, think Prokofiev, think Wagner, Sibelius, who will very deliberately add the tuba as kind of an extension of the double bass sound. Composers will do this to kind of augment sound, kind of give it a little bit more breadth and also change the color ever so slightly by including the tuba. I generally would look for this use of the tuba as a kind of an extension of the double bass section. I would look for that in the music of Prokofiev. Think his Fifth Symphony or his Romeo and Juliet suites. As with the bass section, tubas are often used in conjunction with bassoons, which again kind of makes sense. You think tuba working in tandem with the double bass, the bass voice of the string family, it would make sense that the tuba would also from time to time work in tandem with the bassoons, who are the bass voice of the woodwind family. Personally, me, as a performer, I find the combination of tuba and bassoon to be one of the most interesting timbres. I tend to enjoy music where I have to listen across and collaborate with bassoon players in the orchestra, and I think the tuba plus bassoon sound. It's a really interesting color, kind of the broadness of the tuba sound paired with kind of that slightly nasal double reed quality of the bassoon. One specific composer to listen for this combination is Hector Berlioz, specifically his Symphonie Fantastique. If you listen to the fifth movement, Dream of a Witch's Sabbath, there is of course the famous quote of the Dies Irae, and that actually involves a pairing of tubas and bassoons. Now lastly, sometimes composers and arrangers will pair a tuba with another tuba, or sometimes multiple tubas, or sometimes a tenor tuba. Whenever you have truly grandiose, massively orchestrated music, late romantic, kind of the peak of the orchestra in terms of size, like 4 bassoons in the bassoon section, 4 flutes, 4 clarinets, 4 trombones, 8 horns. When you have those massively orchestrated works, you're sometimes going to see multiple bass or contrabass tubas. Typically the tuba parts, kind of like with the tuba and bass trombone, typically the tuba parts are going to be octaves or unisons against one another. You'll find multiple tubas used in Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, and his Requiem. You'll also find it in Shostakovich's Symphony No. 4. There's some of the tone poems of Richard Strauss, Alpine Symphony, as well as also Sprach Zarathustra. The tenor tuba or euphonium is also occasionally included within the orchestra. It's another conical instrument. It's kind of a bridge between the horn section and the contrabass tuba. It kind of fits there in that registral gap between contrabass tuba and fourth horn. Euphonium is often used in conjunction with the contrabass tuba or with the brass family as a whole, but there are also some notable solos which are called for the tenor tuba to play, and we'll get back to that in a few moments. Look for notable tenor tuba passages in the music of Strauss, for example, Ein Heldenleben. Those of you who remember when the YSO played Ein Heldenleben, that had a tenor tuba part in the orchestra. We had a euphonium player join us for that concert. But also you can find notable tenor tuba parts in Holst's Planet Suite, Strauss's Don Quixote. You can see Mahler's Symphony No. 7, as well as Janacek's Sinfonietta. So now that we've kind of gone through some of the instrumental complements that tubas are a part of within orchestral music, let's talk about the different melodic functions that the tuba is called to present. Now, as I alluded to earlier, being a bass voice, not just of the brass family, but for the whole orchestra, we do often associate the tuba with kind of having a bass line function, kind of laying down rhythmic and harmonic foundation for the orchestra. This can take a couple of different flavors. You can kind of think of oompa music, bum, 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 but also you can think of it in more of a kind of horizontal, sustained manner. Sometimes the tuba is almost like an organ pedal. So here's an example of what you might call a oompa style bass line. This is from Ravel's Bolero. So here's an example of a different type of bass line derived from the opening of the second movement of Anton Bruckner's 7th Symphony, where the tuba is kind of laying down harmonic foundation through sustained tones, but not necessarily delineating rhythm or tempo. Notice how static the music was. It's very much like a dial tone. The music kind of just floats. Now sometimes the line between kind of an oompa style bass line and kind of a static horizontal bass line, sometimes that line can get blurred, especially when the line being played takes on a counter melodic or an introductory function. For example, listen to this excerpt from Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet suite, Montague and Capulet. Now, moving beyond bass lines, the tuba can also be tasked as a melodic and counter-melodic instrument. When the tuba is functioning as an extension of the trombone section, the tuba can often take on the melodic function when the trombones are being featured. Perhaps the most famous example of this would be in Richard Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries. In addition, I've also mentioned a few examples previously. When you think of Fountains of Rome, the duet bass line with the bass trombone, set against the melody above it in the orchestra. But then you also have with the bassoons in Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, that Dies Irae. That's the melody. That's the most interesting thing going on in that musical moment. And that's the tuba working in tandem with the bassoons. Okay, so I technically left out one orchestration, one way that composers and arrangers can write for the tuba. And that's writing for tuba alone. Composers would not only give the tuba melodic or counter-melodic material, tubas get solos in orchestra music. So examples of the tuba taking on not just a melodic function, but a soloist function, there are many. For example, there is the finale to Mahler's Sixth Symphony. After this introductory flourish, there is this descending arpeggio in the double bass, which gives way to this tuba solo, which is actually kind of the personification of the Grim Reaper. In Gershwin's American in Paris, there's actually a notable tuba solo coming immediately after a violin solo. Mexican composer Silvestre Revueltas is another interesting example of a composer who writes for the tuba in a more soloistic manner. For example, if you look at his piece Senza Maya, which features several extended tuba solo passages. Now, as I alluded to earlier, when the euphonium tenor tuba is included within the orchestra, it often takes on a soloistic function. We can see examples of tenor tuba solos in Gustav Holst's Planet Suite, particularly Mars. But there's also Richard Strauss's Don Quixote, where the tenor tuba is actually a musical depiction of the character of Sancho Panza, who is, of course, Don Quixote's squire. Thank you for taking the time today to learn a little bit about the role and function of the tuba in the orchestra. I hope you're well, and I hope to see you in a concert hall very soon.